Crazy Quilts, kaleidoscopic creations of chaos, a popular Victorian pastime, and now my latest stash-busting project. If you're new to the concept of crazy quilts, I did a whole video on what they are, where they started, and when they were the most popular. The TLDR, TLDW, is mishmash quilts using all sorts of shapes, sizes, and types of fabric, started in the USA and were most popular from the early 1880s to late 19-teens. But I do encourage you to check that video out if you want a deeper dive into the history of this Victorian craft. Today I'm going to take you through making my own Victorian-inspired crazy quilt, and I'm aiming to make it as close to historical technique as possible. Now, I know I said my latest stash-busting project, and technically that's true. I bought and own the fabric, therefore it's part of my stash, but all the fabric scraps I'm using in this quilt top did not start out as part of my stash. All the scraps you'll see on this quilt came from the costume department of Murdoch Mysteries. Backstory time, since you're probably all going, what? Let me introduce you to the original Murdoch quilt. This brilliant project was made in 2021, and the idea was created by Joanna Sirakomla, who has been costume designer for our favorite characters since season 12, and Emily Mooney, longtime Murdoch fan and knitter extraordinaire. This is, I think, the greatest fandom collaboration I have ever seen. A Victorian-inspired crazy quilt, all of the individual squares being made of scraps from various costumes throughout the seasons. From Breckenridge's hunting jacket in Fox Hunt, to Julia's dress in Code M for Murdoch, to the bridesmaids' dresses in My Big Fat Mimico Wedding. And all the squares were sewn together by fans from around the world. Altogether, 19 eager crafters took part from right here in southern Ontario all the way to England and Hungary. The quilt was part of the display at the Murdoch exhibit in Kitchener, and in 2023 was auctioned off to raise funds for the Urban Alliance on Race Relations. And in case you're wondering, the grid lines between the squares is made from various Detective Murdoch suits, and the black outer border is made from Constable's uniform pants. This is truly the most epic example of stash busting right here. Now, the intricacy of traditional quilting kinda scares me, and giving crazy quilting a try hadn't previously crossed my mind. But last year, Shannon Makes put out a video about Victorian crazy quilting, and my brain instantly went, ooh, shiny, I want to try. There's something about crazy quilting that feels less intimidating than traditional quilting, and my brain likes the idea of organized chaos and pretty embroidery. As I mentioned in my previous video, the more you sew, the more scraps you generate, and nobody knows that better than a professional costume department. Less than a month after I saw Shannon's video, Joanna and the Murdoch Quilt team announced that at the 2023 CAFTCAD wardrobe sale, you could buy a tote bag for $20 and fill it with scraps from Murdoch Mysteries costumes. Did I drive 3 hours round trip to the far side of Toronto just to buy scraps of fabric? Absolutely yes, I did. And while giggling over the fact that I was actually handling fabric from some of my favorite costumes, I made a split-second decision that I would make my own little Murdoch quilt, and came home with 2 tote bags stuffed to the gills with glorious, colorful fabric. Some of the more hobbity fabrics I set aside to join another upcoming patchwork project, but a large portion of the fabrics went into this quilt. This being my first attempt of a quilt of any kind, there was definitely some trial and error, and I spent a good amount of time looking at my Edwardian crazy quilt before I got started. But once I was ready, I dove right in. This starts, like historical crazy quilts, with a muslin backing. Since there are fabrics of varying shapes, you stitch them to the backing rather than just to the other pieces like with traditional quilt patterns. Once I had my muslin backing cut to the size I wanted, I started picking out fabrics. I decided to start in the middle and work my way outwards, so I had to pick that centerpiece first and then the pieces to go around it. The colors don't necessarily have to be complementary, but they do have to go together. I basted the first piece down, and since there will be fabrics covering all the edges, I didn't worry about turning the raw edges under. I initially tried the method where you put the next fabric right sides matching, stitching them down, and then folding open, but I didn't love the technique, so you'll see I soon gave it up for other methods. One of the cool things about this treasure trove of scraps is that I found some pieces that had already been hemmed or serged, so I could just place them down as is. Because of the hem on this particular piece, I decided to whip stitch it down, which is a historically accurate option. As I became more comfortable with the techniques, I branched out from just working on a single piece at a time. Instead, I pinned multiple pieces into place and then basted down multiple pieces at a time. This sped up the process significantly. And Happy Helper got very attentive as the quilt grew. I continued to research as I stitched and stumbled across a number of crazy quilts that used fan motifs in the non-pattern design. And so thought I, this is a quilt made by a fan, therefore I want to try including a fan. I marked out my seam allowance at the edge and then started by marking out a wedge for the fan base. Then marked out the placement for the leaves of the fan. This was a perfect use for some of the thinner strips of fabric, and I had great fun sorting them out. I only folded over one edge of each piece, since the other edge would be covered by the following fabric, and I couldn't resist adding a bit of lace. Once all the pieces of the fan were pinned in place, I stitched them all down with whip stitches. I finished the fan with a wedge of fabric folded over the bottom of all the leaves and also secured with whip stitches. I love how this fan turned out, and I had so much fun making it, I made another one. In fact, I ended up making a fan for each of the 4 corners of the quilt, and it's one of my favorite things about it. Then I got back to the crazy portion, and at long last got the final piece pinned in place. Once everything was sewn down, it was time for the really fun part, the embroidery. And we actually have some really good resources for embroidery styles of the era. There are obviously existing crazy quilts that we can look at, but there were also lots of magazine articles published during the height of the crazy quilt fad that gave instructions and suggestions for stitches to use. And there was a little instructional book published in 1884 that was entirely instructions for fancy patchwork. I've put the link in the description for anyone who wants to take a look and maybe try it out. And stitches from this book is mostly what I used, varying up the style and size a little bit, depending on what felt right for the different fabrics. I wanted a variety of bold colors to go with the fabrics, so I pulled out my thread stash and picked a mix of cotton and silk embroidery threads. And while for the most part I stuck with Victorian stitches, I did add a little bit of my own flair in places, doing a vine and French knot floral bit over these fabrics. I started from the center of the quilt and worked outward so that I'd gradually have less fabric to reach around. And always the one to look for ways to work smarter, not harder, since at this point I was stitching in the summertime and didn't necessarily want a blanket draped over my lap. I instead draped it over the back of my office chair, which made it a lot easier to wrangle. A design I kept seeing pop up in my research was adding little bits of lace and ribbon as applique, and I happened to pick out some lace and trims at the sale, so I dug out my favorite little pieces and added them to the quilt too. I took a break from embroidery to pin them in place, and then basted them firmly down with whip stitches. And unlike the embroidery where I wanted it to stand out, I made sure to use threads that blended in. And then it was back to embroidery. I kept seeing the feather stitch pop up as a popular option, so I had to give it a try. Unfortunately, try as I might, I could not get it to look like the diagrams, so I ended up taking out the stitches and replacing them with different embroidery, which I like much better. And the beautiful thing about hand sewing projects is that you can take it wherever you go. And if the weather is nice, you can sit outside and enjoy the fresh summer air while you stitch. This was my other, not entirely historical section, making a little garden along this line of fabric, alternating pink and yellow French knot flowers. It was at this point I realized I had been a little skimpy on a couple of my seam allowances, mostly because these were smaller pieces of fabric and I had wanted to show off as much of them as I could. Thankfully, one of the random things I found amongst the bins of scraps was a roll of ribbon, which covers the edges nicely. I cut enough to cover the seams and basted it in place before securing it too with embroidery. I saved the fan corners for last as they were the easiest to handle. And in an homage to the family style of quilts which has people's names embroidered, I did a quick little Murdoch in one corner. And since Detective Murdoch is big on his ultraviolet light, the thread is a blend of cotton and glow-in-the-dark thread. Anachronistic for historical sewing perhaps, but very fitting for the show. Once the embroidery was finally finished, it was time to back the quilt. I wanted a backing fabric that felt Murdoch Mysteries meets dark academia, and I found this awesome bookshelf quilting cotton. It was not as wide as my quilt, so first I cut the length I needed, and then a couple of extra pieces to make up the width. And in keeping with historical practice, I joined the backing fabric together using my 1916 sewing machine. A quick press to make sure everything lays flat. Ooh, what's that upcoming project? Spoilers! One of the best tips I read for joining a quilt together is to tape the backing fabric to your surface before adding the batting and the quilt top. This prevents the backing from shifting when you make your fabric sandwich. While the first Crazy Quilts didn't have batting, the later, more practical ones did, and I wanted mine to be warm and cozy for the fast-approaching long Canadian winters, so batting it is. And before we close it up forever, can we take a minute to appreciate just how cool the back of this quilt top looks? It looks like every Crazy Quilt top I've ever seen at an antique store. Okay, back to assembly. With the batting laid down, I could place the quilt top on top. Because of the embroidery, a Crazy Quilt like this wouldn't get the decorative quilting stitches that you see in a traditional patterned quilt. Instead, they were tied off at regular intervals with cotton, silk, or wool thread. To hold everything in place while I worked on that, I held the layers together with safety pins. Then I could cut away the extra backing fabric and I was ready to get tying. This was a learning experience. I started by making each knot one at a time, but quickly realized there were faster ways, and I switched to threading through multiple strands at once, and then turning the quilt over and tying them all down at once. A lot of tutorials on this suggest just to knot the thread and cut it, leaving the loose ends close to the quilt, but I have sensory issues and wanted it to be as low profile a texture as possible. So I took the extra time to thread the ends in through the quilt and snip them flat so the endy bits didn't stick out. There are a few ways to bind a Crazy Quilt, and some can be quite confusing. I went back and forth for a while before deciding to go with a plain, standard binding method. I had a large piece of purple satiny fabric still in the Murdoch stash, so I cut it into long, straight strips. I snipped off any extra batting and then added my binding to the backing side. I used a strong silk thread to hand sew the binding, and coincidentally, the shade that looked best was called Constable. For sturdiness and to prevent knotting, I waxed the thread, and then did small running back stitches all the way along. Because of the thickness of the quilt, I basically had to do single stitches in and out each time. Then I folded the binding over and finished it off with whip stitches. And there we are, a Victorian-inspired crazy quilt a la Murdoch Mysteries. I am so delighted with how this turned out. It looks like it belongs in the Victorian era, and it's a pretty cool tribute to my favorite TV show, if I do say so myself. And while I don't normally rigorously track the hours I spend on projects, I was kind of curious. In my research on crazy quilts, there was a quote that kept coming up that said it could take up to 1,500 hours to assemble. Now, I was eventually able to track that quote back to the original article in Harper's Bazaar, and it's a reference to one particular quilt that had 9,000 pieces of fabric. Obviously, my quilt does not have that many pieces, but I was still curious. How long would it take? So I tracked my hours for basting the scraps in place and how long it took to embroider. And in true geek fashion, I tracked it using media that I had on in the background. So the final tally is 21.5 hours of Star Trek, 6.8 hours of the Psychologists Are In podcast, 26.75 hours of miscellaneous YouTube videos, 9.2 hours of Farscape, 2.25 hours of Parks and Recreation, 3.25 hours of miscellaneous movies, 2 hours of The Rookie, and 15.75 hours of Murdoch Mysteries, for a total of 86.75 hours of labor. Now, this does not include prepping the muslin, sandwiching the layers, or the binding. This is purely the patchwork side of things. So, a far cry from the 1,500 hours of legend, but still a decent chunk of time. And let me tell you, I'm low-key hooked on crazy quilting now. It's a great way to use up those random scraps of fabric, and it's a sewing project that you can take anywhere and do anytime. You can do a few hours of stitching or a few minutes at a time. And if you're like me and need something to keep your hands busy while you're watching a movie, this is awesome for that. I will definitely be doing more crazy quilting projects in the future. Maybe not a whole entire quilt, but you never know. But absolutely the style, and I encourage you to give it a try yourself. It is so much fun. So a big shout out to Shannon Makes for inspiring me to let go of my inner perfectionist and give crazy quilting a try. And a huge thank you to Emily, Joanna, the Murdoch Mysteries costume department, and the team at Shaftesbury Films for making it possible for fans like me to make incredible projects like this. I am so grateful for this opportunity, and this is truly a project I will treasure forever. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to hit the like button. It really helps tell the algorithm it should recommend the video to more people, which means more folks get to enjoy crazy quilting awesomeness. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. You might just see a little more Murdoch fabric pop up before the end of the year. And I will see you all soon with more geekery meets history sewing adventures. Oh, it's windy. I don't know if you guys can hear how windy it is, but it is definitely a windy fall day. What? What are you doing? Are you supervising? Are you supervising too? Crazy quilting a try. Woohoo! Podcast. Wow. I'm getting there. 21.5 hours of Star Trek, 6